James had always loved the lake. For years, he spent weekends at his cozy cabin, where mornings began with coffee on the porch and evenings ended with golden sunsets reflecting off the water. To him, it was a place of peace, far away from city, noise, and responsibilities. Recently, though, new neighbors had started moving into the community. Most were friendly, eager to share in the calm atmosphere, except for one. Karen, a woman who had barely been around for a month, was already making herself the voice of authority around the lake. James's first encounter with Karen came on a bright afternoon. He was trimming some branches near his porch when a sharp knock echoed from his cabin door. When he opened it, he found Karen standing there with a serious expression, a clipboard, tucked under her arm like she was on official business. "I'm Karen," she introduced herself briskly. "The president of the Lake Homeowners Association." James raised an eyebrow. "Homeowners Association? I wasn't aware there was one here." "Well, there is now," she replied with pride. "And as a homeowner in this community, you're required to join. That means paying fees, attending meetings, and following the rules we've put in place." James tried to remain polite, though inside he was already annoyed. "I'm afraid you must be mistaken. My deed makes it clear. This property isn't under an HOA. I bought this cabin specifically to avoid that kind of oversight." Karen's smile turned into a tight-lipped frown. "Everyone has to participate whether they like it or not." She spun on her heel and walked away, leaving James shaking his head in disbelief. James thought that would be the end of it. After all, surely no one would take her self-made HOA seriously. But the very next morning, he found a folded piece of paper taped to his door. It was a violation notice. Apparently, Karen had decided his fishing boat couldn't be tied to the dock overnight. She listed a fine of $50, handwritten in bold red ink. James laughed and tossed it into the trash, figuring it was a silly prank that would fizzle out. But it didn't. Soon, more letters appeared. Complaints about the color of his shutters, the placement of his firewood, even the style of his mailbox. Each fine grew larger, and Karen's tone in the notes became sharper, filled with phrases like, "You are not above the rules," and "failure to pay will result in further action." Karen's antics grew bolder. She started showing up on his property without permission, clipboard in hand, pointing at his lawn and loudly declaring to neighbors that James was out of compliance. She accused him of ruining the aesthetic of the lake, even though his cabin had stood peacefully for years before she even moved in. Some neighbors rolled their eyes and ignored her. Others began to feel uneasy, worried that Karen might target them next. Slowly, the once friendly community started to shift into one filled with whispers, side glances, and tension, all because of her need to control. James tried to brush it off, focusing on his fishing trips and evening campfires, but it was clear that Karen wasn't backing down. One quiet evening, James was sitting on his porch, reading a book, when the sound of crunching gravel broke the silence. Looking up, he saw flashing red and blue lights reflecting off the lake. A police cruiser pulled into his driveway, and an officer stepped out. Behind him stood Karen, arms crossed, wearing the kind of smirk only someone convinced they had won could wear. The officer approached politely. "Sir, we received a call from your neighbor here. She says you're refusing to comply with your HOA's rules and disrupting the community." James blinked in disbelief, then looked at Karen, who nodded firmly as if she had just delivered the winning blow. Instead of losing his temper, James stayed calm. He invited the officer inside and pulled out his property documents. With patience, he laid out his deed, tax records, and legal paperwork, each one proving beyond a shadow of a doubt that his land was not, and never had been, part of an HOA. The officer glanced through the papers, then turned toward Karen. His tone shifted to firm. "Ma'am, this property is not under any HOA jurisdiction. You cannot create rules and enforce them on private land that isn't part of your association." Karen stammered, insisting she had the authority, but the officer shut her down. "This is not a police matter. Don't misuse our services for personal disputes." With that, he tipped his hat to James and left, clearly unimpressed. Karen's smirk had vanished. As the officer drove away, Karen huffed and said, "Fine, I'll just take this up with the landlord." She stormed off, muttering under her breath, leaving James standing on his porch with a half-smile tugging at his lips. Because the truth was, he was the landlord. The cabin Karen rented at the far end of the lake? It belonged to him. She had unknowingly been renting his property this whole time. James had kept that fact quiet, letting her dig her own hole, but now her behavior had gone too far. The next morning, James walked over to Karen's rental cabin. He knocked, and when she opened the door, her confident expression faltered as she saw the envelope in his hand. "This," James said calmly, "is a notice regarding your lease." Inside was a formal reminder of the terms she had agreed to when moving in, terms that clearly stated harassment of neighbors and creating disturbances could lead to immediate termination of tenancy. Karen's face turned pale. She fumbled for words, trying to defend herself, but James remained steady. "I'm not here to argue. I'm here to remind you that this community is supposed to be a place of peace, not conflict. If you can't respect that, your stay here will end sooner than you expect." For once, Karen had nothing to say. From that day forward, everything changed. Karen's so-called HOA meetings vanished overnight. No more notes appeared on James's door, no more made-up fines circulated through the neighborhood, and no more police cars showed up in his driveway. The neighbors noticed the shift immediately. Conversations returned, laughter filled the air again, and the lake community slowly regained its charm. As for Karen, she became noticeably quieter. The clipboard disappeared, and she kept to herself. James, on the other hand, returned to the peaceful routine he had always loved, fishing at dawn, sipping coffee on his porch, and watching the sun set over the water. He didn't need to raise his voice or retaliate. The truth alone had been enough, and though Karen never admitted it, out loud everyone knew. She had learned her lesson the hard way.